Greetings and welcome, Banner.
Beggar!
In M&BII 2 Bannerlord, I wouldn't dare say that TaleWorlds provides an insufficient introduction to the gameplay controls and mechanics, especially given the game is in early access. I would volunteer that the tutorials in their current state are perhaps in short supply and
exiguous,
by which I mean that when I played through them at least, the tutorial tells you how to click, then how to move, attack and block in 4 directions, and then unleashes you upon the world. While this is probably enough for most people to get by, particularly if you've put over 1,000 hours into the previous games, there are a lot of mechanics that are far from obvious or simply unexplained to the player. So in this video I'll be describing some of the interstewing and unexplained mechanics related to combat controls and how combat actually works. Some of these mechanics are carried over from M&BII Warband and thus will be useful to players that are new to the series, and some are completely new to Bannerlord and thus will be useful even to veterans of the series. Here's a few disclaimers, feel free to pause the video if you want to read them. I'd like to emphasize that this is not a combat guide or tutorial. If you want me to go into detail about a specific feature or mechanic, if you think I've missed something important or if I've made a mistake somewhere, please let me know in the comments, and if I make a follow-up video, I'll add content and issue corrections where suitable. And just before we get into it, I want to give a lot of appreciation to my mate Augustus, who has dedicated hours of his time to helping me test and record for this video. So without further ado, combat controls and key bindings. I'm not going to go over all the standard key bindings, you can obviously do that yourself in the options. I will be going over a few select key bindings that either aren't specified in the options or I think could use better descriptions or have complicated mechanics. I won't be covering troop commands, but I can do that in another video if there is sufficient interest, so let me know if you want to see another video on that. Firstly, I'll cover left alt, which generally shows indicators, but because it's context sensitive, what it shows can change depending on the scene that you're in. In all scenes, it shows interactable items such as chairs.
sit down.
In single player battles, it shows where troop leaders are for friendly and enemy troops. In multiplayer scenes, it shows where objectives are, such as flags and siege mode. It shows the location of teammates, which is useful if you're playing with friends. And it shows drop weapons that you can pick up, which is very useful because dropped equipment in multiplayer is often impossible to see. In civilian scenes, such as taverns, lords' halls, and towns, it shows where scene locations are, such as shops, and where named characters are. On the campaign map, you can use it to see extra info about parties on the campaign map. In this context, I like to use it to see whether there are any enemy parties that have high-level prisoners that I can then absorb into my party if I defeat them.
That'll do.
It's also useful for seeing which troops in enemy parties are wounded. Often the highest tier troops will be wounded, and so by checking this, you might be willing to take on some much larger enemy parties.
Yes! 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 Yes!
It's worth noting that left alt doesn't highlight missiles in single player. It was probably limited intentionally as an optimization, but you'll have to manually search for things like arrows and bolts.
The old-fashioned way.
The kick function, E by default, is something that most people know about but don't use. But I think that more people would use it if they knew that you can actually get a true combo from a kick into a hit. The timing window is much more strict than it was in Warband, and it is somewhat stance dependent, but it is possible. Shout out to Winero for letting me know about this by testing it on me. There are 2 tricks to successfully comboing from a kick into a hit. The first is that you need to treat it like a chain attack, so you pretty much buffer your swing the instant your kick connects. The second is that the attack direction is important. A successful kick will almost always combo with overhead swings and thrusts, but in my experience will only combo with a horizontal swing if you use the opposite swing from your kicking foot. So if you kick with your right foot, you need to do a left swing and vice versa. You can control your kicking foot with your stance, and I'll talk about that later in this video. Most people also know that you can shield bash with a shield equipped by holding block and pressing kick, but I noticed that some people didn't know that you can also bash with any weapon while blocking. Regarding the kick mechanics, there are 3 important things to remember. Firstly, you are prevented from blocking if you bash or kick with a shield equipped. Secondly, without a shield, bashing prevents you from blocking, but if you kick, you can still block every direction except for thrusts. And lastly, even without a shield, kicking gives your opponent a chance to get past you and attack you behind your block. It's probably also worth noting that kicks can't be blocked, and that shield bashes and weapon bashes can only be blocked if you have a shield equipped. F and G. You can hold G to bring up a weapon wheel and drop a weapon from any slot. I tend to use this while running somewhere so that the weapon swap animation doesn't slow me down. But bonus tip, I tested this assumption and found that the weapon swap animation actually doesn't slow you down at all. You can also hold F while picking up a weapon to choose which slot to put it in, and thus select the weapon to drop while you're picking up a weapon. The slots that appear are context sensitive depending on what equipment you have in your inventory. A bonus tip, if your back slot is empty in a combat scene, you can actually pick up an extra shield from the ground that you wouldn't usually be able to equip in the inventory screen. But you can't hold more than 2 shields, one on your back and one on your left arm. If you pull out a 2-handed weapon like a bow with a shield already on your back, the shield on your left arm will be dropped. Since I'm feeling these bonus tips, the mechanics for dropping things are as follows. If you have a weapon and a shield equipped and press G, you will drop the weapon. However, if you hold block and press G, you will drop the shield. If you press G with a shield but no weapon equipped, you will also drop the shield. If you press G while all weapons are sheathed, and after you've dropped your ranged weapon, it will drop the ranged ammo. Remembering you can do any of this by holding G and selecting the item that you want to drop. The tilde key. Tilde key? You can hold the tilde key to look around your character without changing the direction that you are facing. I use this all the time to avoid slowing my run animation, particularly if I'm conscious of getting hit from behind by cavalry. You can also use this to trick cavalry into attacking you from behind, because they're cowardly bastards. You just have to be careful with the turning animation, as the character turns at a different rate to the screen, and this can cause your attack to overshoot or undershoot. The X key is used for alternating weapon usage and is almost the same as Warband. There is a feature that I don't recall being in Warband where you press X to toggle some weapons being used as either one-handed or two-handed. This is applicable where the weapon has one-handed and two-handed usage modes in the description. Examples include the falx, but not the long falx of the Fian, and the bastard sword. I just said sword.
What purpose did my parents have having me? I have to get to the bottom of why I'm so dumb.
The bastard sword of the Earthsworn. The other functions for the X key are identical to Warband, so you can switch from range to melee for some throwing weapons. Although disappointingly, you can't seem to do this with throwing axes anymore.
Disappointed!
You can couch the big stick things
It's called a lance. Hello?
on horseback to do massive damage. And a bonus tip for the big stick things, I saw a fairly heavily liked comment on YouTube from someone who thought that you needed to attack by clicking left mouse button after couching the lance. So a quick PSA for usage of a couch lance. Once you're up to speed, the icon comes up in the lower right. You just press X to couch and then you aim your lance and run into your target. There is no need for attacking after couching. You can spur a horse by either double tapping forward or holding forward and tapping kick. The more you tap, the more you spur. And you can slow a horse by either double tapping backwards or holding backwards and tapping kick. Okay, so you can strafe with your horse, but when I was testing this, my inputs were a bit inconsistent. I'll explain the basics first and then I'll add the caveats. In my testing, you had to be more or less stationary when starting. To strafe left, while holding left, you tap E. That's it. You don't need to hold E after you start your strafe, but you do need to hold left for as long as you want to strafe. If you release left, you have to repeat the process. To strafe right, you do the opposite. Now the caveats and side notes. If you press forward while strafing, you will stop strafing and start moving forwards. You can put some minor backwards movement into a strafe. You don't have to go squarely left or right. You add the backwards movement while you're already strafing. During my testing, there were two things that I could do in the left direction that I couldn't replicate in the right direction. The first was that I could, from a complete stop, immediately start strafing diagonally backwards left. The second was that I could already be backing up and then start strafing in the left direction. I couldn't do any of these in the right direction because of a hardware limitation on my keyboard, but I'm assuming there's no reason that this wouldn't work in-game if your hardware supports it. Lastly, I've seen some people recommend looking down or looking at your horse as though you're going to dismount in order to be able to get this strafing to work, but I didn't need to do any of that. If you follow the instructions, I'm hoping it should work for you. Supplementary suggestion: you can go up most stairways with horses if you go backwards or at enough of an angle. So don't be like this guy, be like this guy. Oh, wrong clip, this guy. The last control I want to cover is using M&BII to hold your bow at the ready after you've already drawn an arrow. This actually halves the time it takes to fire your first arrow, which can obviously be useful. Even though I knew it was faster, I never actually used this because I thought that holding M&BII would slow down my run animation, but testing for this video revealed that this actually doesn't slow you down at all, so this is something that I'll probably use more moving forward. Moving on to combat mechanics. You'll know from playing the game and looking at weapon descriptions that there are 3 damage types: cut, pierce, and blunt. The general rule of thumb is that bladed weapons use cut damage for left, right, and overhead swings, and pierce damage for thrust attacks, assuming they can be thrusted. And blunt weapons such as maces do blunt damage on swings. There are exceptions to this trend, such as the scythe, which does pierce damage on swing attacks, and the spike mace, which is blunt for swings but can also be thrust for pierce damage. But generally speaking, the damage types are fairly intuitive. If you're not sure, you can just check the weapon description. The two main reasons that damage types are important are firstly because in single player, blunt damage reduces the chance of killing opponents, meaning that you'll get more prisoners if you're going for that ruthless slaver playthrough.
You better not be a manhunter.
And secondly, because different damage types have different levels of effectiveness against different armor ratings. To understand the second reason better, we'll first need to understand the concept of absorb damage. If you played the game with damage indication on, you'd notice that on a hit, the game will report delivered damage and absorbed damage. Delivered damage is the damage that is subtracted from the health bar, and absorbed damage is the amount of damage that was prevented from being delivered by the armor rating. So the total damage is the sum of delivered damage plus absorbed damage. So I ran a bunch of tests for different damage types against different armor ratings, and there were 2 major findings. Firstly, as you would expect, as armor rating improves, the proportion of absorbed damage increases and thus delivered damage decreases, and that is true across all damage types. And secondly, blunt and pierce damage types are much more effective at delivering damage against high armor ratings. I'll put the results of my testing up on the screen while I lay down some pros and cons of each damage type. So you might ask, if the blunt and pierce damage types are better at delivering damage, why not just use them all the time? And there's too many reasons not to use these, really. For example, if a weapon deals both cut and pierce damage, the cut damage is almost always higher than the pierce damage. And in the same vein, for any given tier of weapon, a cutting weapon will almost always have a higher base damage than an equivalent blunt weapon. So in cases where your opponent has low or medium armor, because your total damage is higher with a cut attack, you'll often deliver more damage than you would with a blunt weapon, even if their armor is absorbing more damage. Another reason is that many two-handed weapons just don't give a For weapons like the Bardiche or the M&BII, even if you're dealing cut damage, their total damage is so damn high that it often only takes 1 or 2 hits to kill even the most heavily armored opponents. Using a one-handed blunt weapon, on the other hand, might take between 3 and 5 hits. A third reason is that piercing thrust attacks can be really quite difficult to hit. You have to track your opponents well to avoid missing completely, and there's a higher risk of bouncing off. Bouncing is a mechanic that I'll talk about in a minute. Another reason again is that weapons with cut damage tend to have better range than their equivalent blunt counterparts. The list goes on.
Keeps going and going and going and going.
So when would you actually use a blunt weapon then? Well, if you're versing an opponent team or army with heavily armored troops but can't use a big two-handed weapon, for example if there are enemy archers or if you're getting ganked by multiple opponents and need to use a shield, then you can use a blunt weapon such as a mace to be more effective against troops with high armor ratings. There are also some locations that are better suited to weapons with low range so that you don't clang on the surrounding walls or people. I tend to use maces a lot in siege game modes rather than in TDM. As you can see here, the berserkers are struggling to hit anyone because their two-handed axes keep on bouncing off their teammates, while my mace enables me to get my swings off despite the crowd. You've probably observed sweet spotting while playing, but I think it's worth pointing out that there are three major types of sweet spots. The body location sweet spot is fairly obvious. Damage delivered changes depending on where you hit or are hit. Most of the time you want to aim for the head, not just with ranged, but with melee as well. The second sweet spot category is the sweet spot of the weapon that you're using. If you hit with the intended point of contact for your weapon, it will do much more damage. When you fail to get your weapon sweet spot, you will always do reduced damage, but sometimes you will do no damage at all. And the last type of sweet spot is the swing band sweet spot. The band of your swing, which is usually an arc unless you're thrusting something,
Giggity.
obviously has a start up, a middle point and an end, and the damage that you deal changes across that band. So even if you hit someone with the weapons sweet spot, like the blade of the bardiche, if you're hitting them with the very end of your swing, you're not going to do optimal damage.
Thank me, and thank me, and me, and me.
I find that this is a big problem with thrusting, since the optimal window for sweet spotting seems to be very small in comparison to swing attacks. Talking about sweet spots, it would be remiss of me not to mention bouncing. A bounce occurs when you stuff up your sweet spots so badly that you fail to interrupt your opponent. If your opponent is swinging, this will often result in you getting your skull cracked. There is actually a coded parameter for the minimum damage that you must deal in order to force an interrupt, and this is currently set to 5 health points. Fun fact, there is also a coded parameter for damage required to get a horse to rear, and that is currently set at 30. But there's obviously more to getting a horse to rear than just damage. Going over some shield mechanics, it's worth noting that shield damage changes depending on if you block in the direction of the oncoming attack. If you do, shield damage is reduced by 50%, and thus your shield will last longer. For some reason, being in your right stance also reduces the shield damage by 10%. There is a theory that having a shield on your back will reduce or prevent damage. In my testing I got mixed results and found something a little bit strange. Firstly, I did confirm that damage was very slightly reduced if you hit the abdomen, shoulder or chest, but this didn't happen 100% of the time. When it did work, it was usually accompanied by a shield impact sound. Having said this, I also found that if something was going to hit your legs, for example a bolt, but your shield covers your legs, the hit location was transported from your legs to your chest. So in these instances, because you typically take more damage with a hit to the chest than to the legs, you might actually take more damage if you have a shield on your back than if it just hit you in the leg. If you played enough to bother watching this video, you've probably also noticed that characters actually have a stance, which is typically determined by the last lateral direction you've moved in. The stance will either be a southpaw or orthodox stance, corresponding with the left and right directions respectively. I'll just call them the left and right stances to make it easier to follow. Your stance affects a number of things, most of them in a fairly minor way. Things like which side of your body your overhead swing will move to, how quickly your swing will get to a certain point in space. A couple of things I mentioned earlier is that it affects which foot you kick with, and the right stance also reduces the shield damage by 10%. It also seems to have a small impact on range, particularly with spears and thrusting attacks. However, one genuinely useful application that I use all the time is chain attacks for two-handed weapons. You probably already know that you can chain together hit and missed attacks, but not blocked or clanged attacks. And you do this by starting another swing while already in a swing animation. For whatever reason, TaleWorlds decided that in your left stance in particular, if you chain an overhead swing into a left swing, there is virtually no end lag at the end of your first swing. So what I do on a pretty regular basis is get into the left stance, intentionally miss my overhead swing, and then chain my overhead swing into a left swing. If you orchestrate your swing too much, or if you use it too much, your opponent will probably start their swing earlier and still hit you, but I find it really useful as a mix-up. The key thing to be careful about is to avoid clanging your overhead swing with the ground, as that will prevent you from chaining into your left swing. In terms of the stance affecting the swing speed to the point of being noticeably beneficial, I've only found it to be the case with these two swings. However, I think that the stance does change the timing for pretty much every combination of chain attacks. You're of course aware of the 4 directions for hitting and blocking, but people often don't account for relative speed, body rotation, and relative positioning, all of which are really important if you don't want to become cannon fodder and you want to increase your chance of hitting first and maximizing the damage that you deal on a successful hit. In simple terms, speed is how far an object can move in a given time. If you move 2 meters in 2 seconds, your speed is 1 meter per second, or according to this very useful and not at all confusing COVID-19 Beatles infographic, half a Beatles band per second. Relative speed is how quickly objects are moving with respect to each other. So if we start at the same point and I'm moving east at 1 meter per second and you're moving east at 1 meter per second, we will always stay the same distance away from each other and our relative speed is 0. If you're moving towards me at a speed of 1 meter per second and I'm moving towards you at a speed of 1 meter per second, our relative speed is 2 meters per second. In Bannerlord, the game uses relative speed to form part of a damage multiplier. While Warband had a similar mechanic and reported the damage bonus directly, Bannerlord just reports the relative speed and the damage bonus is calculated behind the scenes. Not worrying about the specifics for now, the takeaway is that if you're trying to maximize damage, you should increase your relative speed, and if you're trying to minimize damage, you should try and reduce your relative speed. So if you flanked an opponent and you have a free hit on them, don't run up behind them and then stop before hitting them.
I got numbers on the.
Oh! Yo, did he just walk up slowly and down smash?
And likewise, if you're trying to take down a rider's mount, you can actually increase your damage to the horse by running towards your opponent. Note that the relative speed multiplier applies to both melee and ranged attacks. Using body rotation defensively. When you're blocking the direction of a swing, if your body isn't rotated properly, your block won't stop the arc of the opponent's swing and you'll still get hit. This seems obvious enough, but I still get caught out pretty often, and you can also use this mechanic to your advantage if you think that your opponent has low mouse sensitivity. One thing that I find myself frustrated with personally in Bannerlord wasn't really a problem in Warband, and that is that players can run past you and hit you with the end of their swing even if they don't turn around, so it's really important to take that into account when you're on the defensive. Modifying this comment slightly, for any block to be successful, it actually doesn't necessarily have to be in the same direction as the opponent's swing. Generally speaking, your weapon just needs to physically intercept their weapon before it hits you. So where you would typically block a right swing with a left block, depending on the rotation of your body, you can actually block a right swing with a right block, and vice versa. I find this useful when versing multiple opponents and I don't have time to change my block direction. This usefulness is compounded because in Bannerlord there is a slight block delay that is introduced by the animation needing to be mostly complete before the block actually becomes active. Using your body positioning defensively, you should constantly be using your footwork to position yourself so that you, 1, won't get easily kicked or shield bashed, and 2, so that you're out of your opponent's sweet spots when they're swinging their weapons. Using these mechanics offensively is fairly simple. You can use your body rotation and positioning to change how quickly your hitbox will strike your opponent after your animation starts. For body rotation, after starting your swing, you can then rotate your character's viewpoint so that your weapon will make contact earlier than if you didn't rotate your character. And body positioning has a similar mechanic. The speed at which your swing strikes depends on where your body is relative to your opponent and what type of swing you've used. So generally if you're standing to the right of your opponent, you want to use a left swing and vice versa. Keep in mind that when body rotation and positioning are used offensively, your damage output will also be affected by the sweet spotting that we discussed earlier. Some weapons are negative on block depending on things like your character's weapon skill, your swing direction, your opponent's weapon, your body rotation and relative positioning. When I say negative on block, I mean that even if you successfully block an opponent's attack, they will still be able to swing and hit you before you can swing and hit them. For example, assuming you and your opponent are in range of each other's weapons, most weapons and characters will beat out the cavalry mace. My recommendation here is to experiment to figure out which weapons are negative on block, and then never use them. And on the other side of the coin, if you see your opponent using one of these, you can take advantage if you have a faster weapon. When you get hit, there is a period of time where you cannot input certain actions, indeed most actions. So you can't attack, block, kick, bash, or even switch weapons. The prevention of the weapon switch in particular really gets my panties in a bunch, because if you're caught with a ranged weapon in close quarters combat, or you're accidentally switching to a throwing weapon or so on, you're in pretty big trouble. Another problem with hit stun is that it doesn't buffer input either, so you kind of have to spam your weapon switch until the animation starts. I personally would prefer a buffer method, similar to the warband mechanic, but we need to work with what we have. The heavy swing in Bannerlord occurs when you've held a swing in its ready state for a short period, and it has its pros and cons. In my testing, going from the start of the swing to the ready state was about 1/3 of a second, and given the average human reaction time is about 1/4 of a second, the main con is that you can get easily beaten out by someone that is just starting their swing if you don't react immediately. This is obviously made more difficult when you introduce connection delays. The second major con is that when released from the ready state, swings still have about 1/3 of a second of drawback and startup animation before the hitbox becomes active, which makes the release of a heavy swing fairly reactable. The main pro of heavy swings is that a damage multiplier can be applied.
Get your hopes up, Chris.
However, because this damage multiplier is currently set to 1, heavy swings actually don't do any more damage at the moment, and thus currently don't have any pros at all.
Oh, okay. Then I guess just pout.
We might as well talk about the crash through mechanic, which currently isn't implemented in the main version of the game yet, unless I don't have any footage of it, but it has been implemented in the beta as of beta version 1.4.3, which means that it will be coming to the main game once all the creases are ironed out. Essentially, crash through applies to both lances and overhead swings of two-handed weapons, and gives the swingers a chance of hitting through the defender's block, even if they block in the correct direction. The patch notes also mention the chance of crush through is increased for two-handed maces. Unfortunately, also mentions that lance crush through won't be applied in multiplayer.
Oh, thank God.
I thought this game mechanic was terrible in Warband, and I'm horrified that they brought it into Bannerlord.
Salty.
We talked about hit stun, which prevents certain actions after you've been hit, but there's also a small stun window when you successfully block an attack, and I'm calling that defender block stun. Defender block stun doesn't seem to depend on the overhead heavy swings as it did in Warband, but instead it's affected by things like your shield or weapon weight, whether or not you have a polearm or two-handed weapon equipped, among other things. So if you're wondering why it sometimes takes longer to react out of a successful block, this is why. There is an active block versus passive block system. If we consider a passive block to be where you hold your block well in advance of an incoming swing, it has no special effect. However, there is also an active block mechanic where instead of holding your block well in advance, if you raise your block in a small window just before the attack connects, the defender has less block stun, and in my testing it also seemed to show that the attacker was slightly delayed before they can input another attack. Here's one that really gives me the SH1Ts. If you get knocked over by a horse, you can't block or attack. You're fucked. However, if you're playing with cavalry and your horse dies under you, after a brief period of immobility, you can start to swing and block. Although it does seem as though your character's rotation arc is briefly restricted until you fully stood up. In my opinion, TaleWorlds have got this mechanic backwards, and I think the foot soldier should be the one that's able to block after being knocked over, and the cavalry unit should be proper gonskis. But you're not watching this video for my opinions. Chamber blocking. Chamber blocking is a mechanic where you block an incoming swing with the startup of your own swing. And while it was useful in Warband, it is unreliable gutter trash in Bannerlord. I've already put out a separate video on this if you want to see the problem explored a little bit more, but my recommendation for now is to avoid the mechanic until it's fixed. Multiplayer in-game chat is usually full of questions like, how do you do that wiggly shit? Or what the fuck was that? Or comments like, you're a fucking hacker. And usually this has something to do with feinting. It will be easy to explain how the feinting mechanic works if I break down how an attack works, so let's do that. Now, a swing can be broken down into 4 stages. I'm sorry I don't know the proper combat terminology, so I've just made up the terms as follows. 1 is the backswing, 2 the ready state, 3 the release, and 4 the committal. So defining each of these stages, the backswing is the part of the animation required to get the weapon into the ready state. This is the part of the swing that can chamber block the swings of opponents. The ready state is the state after the swing has already been fully drawn back, but before you release the left mouse button to actually release the swing. You can hold the left mouse button to keep your swing in the ready state. The release is the intermediate stage after your swing has been released from the ready state, but before the swing enters the committal stage. And the committal stage is the part of the swing where you can no longer cancel your animation with a block. That is, you're fully committed to your swing. So feinting is possible between stages 1 to 3 of the swing. The feint is achieved by starting an attack in one direction, blocking to cancel the swing, and then starting a new attack either in the same direction or a different direction. So while you can feint in stage 2, generally the most effective feints occur in stages 1 and 3, but you can decide that for yourself. Here are some feints in stage 1. The main benefit of feinting in stage 1, in my opinion, is that the drawing back of the swing in multiple directions very quickly creates a lot of movement in your animations that can be hard to follow. I don't find stage 1 feints to be very effective when your character is stationary, but I'll give a bonus hint in a little bit that'll make a big difference to the efficacy of these feints in my opinion. Here are some feints in stage 2. I don't personally see much benefit from feinting in the ready state. And here are some feints from stage 3. There are a couple of major benefits from feinting in the release stage. The first is that because you can feint from the same direction multiple times, the animation to get from the swing back to the ready state is very short, so the feints can be faster than other types of feints. And the second is that if you delay your feint until it is almost committed, the swing sound will actually come out. And so you can make it both look and sound like you've swung. Many opponents will think you've missed your swing entirely and will drop their guard. So the aforementioned bonus hint works in all stages of feinting, and it's simply a recommendation to use your character movement and rotation to make it harder to read your swing. Breaking this down a little bit, it's effective to start your swing, rotate your body to conceal your feint, and then come back with a swing from a different direction. I get juked all the time when people change from a right swing to an overhead swing while rotating their body to the right. Very tricky stuff. If you're good at spacing, you can also try intentionally missing your opponent to begin a chain attack and then feint out of the chain attack. The chain attack animations are often quicker than other swing animations, so using them in feints can make it really hard to react. So you probably picked up on it by now, but I thought I'd mention it specifically. Range is really important, and because of increased troop movement speed in Bannerlord, I will go so far as to say that it's much more important in Bannerlord than it was in Warband. Most people are going to try and space you if they've got a longer weapon or a higher movement speed, particularly if they're not confident in their blocking skill. So if you're short on either weapon length or movement speed, then be prepared to block multiple times before you're able to get a hit off. Experienced players will use both spacing and pristine timing to dodge your attack and then hit you while you're in the committal stage of your attack, thus making their attack unblockable. Bolts and arrows are recoverable from the ground and wooded objects, but tend to break if they impact a stone surface. I understand that throwing weapon destruction depends on a missile's velocity when it hits a surface, but they're almost always recoverable. This one isn't a combat mechanic, but I just want to let people know that in multiplayer, ping is extremely important. This is probably really obvious to a lot of people, but I couldn't count the number of times that I've seen people in chat ask why they can't hit anyone, and then I check and they've got 250 plus ping. When dueling, I find it personally much more difficult if I've got above 60 to 80 ping, and if you're just playing in TDM or Siege, it's probably workable up to 150 ping, depending on what role you're playing. If you have more ping than this, you're gonna have a bad time.
Gonna have a bad time.
If I think of any other mechanics worth mentioning while editing, I'll put those here. In doing research for this video, I came across a video from a YouTuber named Zerkovich, and he has a couple of videos on combat mechanics and damage types, and I strongly recommend checking those videos out. I'll leave some links in the description. That's it for this video. One might say subscribe for more content like this, and I was going to work on another video about campaign mode mechanics, but this video took me so fucking long to make that the statistical probability of that happening now approaches 0. I hope you found this video useful. Thanks for watching.
Away with you, vile beggar!